Hey everybody, and welcome to Hike Hearth. I want to start this video by showing off this awesome t-shirt that Dustin got me for Christmas. I am a fan of crows, corvids. No, they're not corvids.
Corvids.
Corvids. And look what it says. It says crows before bros, which I think is just awesome. So I decided to wear it today. But as you can obviously tell by my first comment, I am not the birder in the family, and I have what I consider to be kind of an interesting topic that I thought we would talk about today, which is the people in the world who go out and count birds for Christmas. And Dustin is one of them. But before we get to that, I was hoping, Dustin, for anybody who doesn't know who you are, and why I'm asking you these questions as we're hanging out today, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name's Dustin Neild. I'm a local conservationist in suburban Boston. I got into birding more as a hobby 10 or 15 years ago. It's blossomed from there, so I like taking it into the education sector, helping people learn about the environment through photos and videography, stuff like that, and doing local conservation work. So we're actually on the ground helping improve habitat every year.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So I mentioned that there's a bunch of people that like to go out at Christmas time and count birds. And I know about this because I'm married to Dustin. And I know you've been doing this for a number of years. And I know that you've explained to me in the past why this is happening. And I've somewhat listened, but I was hoping we could start off by let's start with the foundational information. What is this event? Why does it seem to happen at Christmas time, which seems like a really weird time of year to count birds? And is this like a newer thing that you discovered as like a holiday event when you started like birding? Like, where does all this come from?
Time scale a little bit. It's certainly not a new thing by current standards, but it was long a tradition to go hunting for birds on Christmas Day.
Oh, I don't like that. That's sad.
People weren't working because they had the day off, and hunting was both a way to gather food and for sport. So there was some collecting of different species as well. But around the 1900s, when birds were starting to become noticeably scarce, right around the same time that women were wearing feathers in their hats to decorate their attire, and birds were becoming scarce because of things like that, someone had the idea, well, instead of hunting birds on Christmas Day, let's go out and count all the birds that we can find on Christmas Day. And that might be the first citizen science experiment that came into the world, because now that started around 1900, and here we are almost 125 years later, and we have scientific data now at the local ground level, at the specific species level of detail, that help us understand how many birds are here compared to how many birds were here in 1900.
Wow. How many people participated in the first one? Do you know?
The first one was really small. I think 27, 30 people, something like that. And they, had it in their head that they wanted to get out and find everything they could in a specific area. So they got after it. At that time, they did just 25 locations, basically one location per person, and they had about 90 species. Wow.
Okay. So I know of a couple of people through you that do this. Is there how big is it? Is this a major event for birders, or?
It's not a major event for birders, but it is a major event for birding coverage. So there might be, 10 million birders in the U.S. There's probably nowhere near that many participants in the Christmas bird count, because you don't just want people canvassed everywhere, stationary, right? You want to be able to move around, look for stuff, but you also don't want to double cover places. And you want some kind of site fidelity for your data collection, that you go to the same places year after year with the same number of similar numbers of observers, those sorts of things. Because if you just had 10 times as many volunteers this year, naturally you would see more birds, and you wouldn't want to interpret that as there being an abundance of great blue herons or something, even though.
Got it. Okay. And we're going to get more into the counting part in a little bit, because This, I have more questions about what you've
All
just
right.
kind of alluded to already. But okay, so I know you've been doing this for quite a while. But do you remember when, like, how long have you been doing this for now? And like, why did you get involved in just wandering around counting
I
birds?
think my first Christmas bird count was in 2016 or 2017, a couple of years after I had gotten into birding seriously as a hobby. And I had gotten involved with a local birding group called the Boxborough Birders here in suburban Massachusetts. And they happened to be the ones responsible for a portion of the local circle. And so they mentioned that they were doing the Christmas count, and if anybody wanted to join them to volunteer, that they divide their town up into several teams, and I joined a team and got out there. So like I said, this might have been my 9th year, maybe my 8th. I'd have to see if I have emails from that far back to confirm it.
Okay. And I know this year was a little different from Dustin because I happened to meet a friend of his who is actually one of the leaders of the local bird watching group, right? And she was going away for the holiday and kind of passed things over to you.
That's right. She founded that Boxborough Birders group more than 20 years ago and has been actively birding in the area since before that. A number of years ago, she had been sort of delegated the task of doing the compilation for all of her town, which is just one of about 10 or 12 towns in the local area that are part of that circle. So she organizes the teams, assigns the territories. Everyone goes out, counts all of the individuals of each species that they see and report them back to her. She aggregates the team and feeder level data up to the full circle.
Okay. All right. So that's what an organizer does. Yep. All right. So let's get into how this works, because I've always struggled with this entire concept of everyone going, well, a lot of people going out and counting birds, because how do you make sure that you're not double counting birds? How are you possibly realistically planning to go out and count all the birds? Like, it just, how does a bird count work?
Well, just like it sounds, first you have to define your territory. And this is a little bit old school, but the territories were set up in circles that were a circle with a 15-mile diameter or a 7.5-mile radius, if you look at it from the center outward. In today's day and age with GPS, it would be probably easier if the territories were a little more specific by town or whatever, or by, a square grid kind of pattern. But these 15-mile circles are the way it's always been done. And for data consistency, we're sticking with that.
Okay. All right.
The second is you then break down that circle either by town or by specific area. So, like I said, in our area, there's about 10 towns that are in whole or in part a part of the Concord, Massachusetts circle.
Can you kind of go over, like, logistically, how does the bird count work? Like, how much ground are you trying to cover in the course of a day? Like, how is it split up amongst the volunteers?
Well, every town is a little bit different, and usually the circle is broken down into leaders for each town, and then the town leader decides how to break up that specific territory. Usually it uses major geographic landmarks or roads to differentiate it. So if you had a river running down the middle of your town, it might be, your team is west of the river and my team's east of the river. Or in my case, our local town was broken into basically thirds: the southern third, the western third, and the northern third, so to speak. And everything below one of the major state roads was for the team that I was handling. I don't know what our exact geographic area that was covering, but we drove about 23 miles during the day and walked about 6 miles on foot over the course of 8 hours.
Wow. So that's a lot. All right. So you guys all volunteer and you count up all these birds, and then you get all this data and you give it to Audubon. And what happens? Like, what do they do with the data that they're collecting?
Yeah. So first it all aggregates up, right? The team reports to the town leader reports to the circle leadership. And often there's a big social event to do the count out. And that had turned virtual the last couple of years, but it's finally returning as a live count out in our area this time. That's going to be this coming Saturday, where everyone will go and all the team leaders will basically report they'll call out each species, and each town will report what they saw for that species in order.
So it's like cardinals, 25, yay! Is that really how it works?
Pretty much, yeah. So everyone will have their list of totals for their town that are contributing to the overall total. And then that information is used partly for the scientific record over time, partly, I'm sure, for some Audubon applications and surveys and things like that. And then it's available to be used by, the public for research purposes. And I'm sure it gets included in stuff that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology does and other conservation organizations like that.
Okay. All right. Do they what do they do with, what does the data do? Okay, great. So now Audubon knows how many cardinals have been counted in the country versus previous years.
So, for example, we had, I think, about 12 northern cardinals that we saw in my portion of the count that I had yesterday. What's notable is, for example, if you go to who lived on the lake on the pond in Concord?
Henry David Thoreau.
So, for example, if you go to Henry David Thoreau's notes in Concord, Massachusetts during his time, which was, I don't know, was that the
1860?
Something like that. Anyway, he wrote about all of the flora and fauna that he saw. There were no cardinals in Concord in his time.
Interesting.
We're not far from Concord. We saw 12 cardinals, but that's a bird we see every day in our yard.
Yeah. Wait, so he participated in this?
He didn't, but I'm saying this was after his time.
What you're
but what
saying.
I'm saying is, by comparison, we know that there were no cardinals here in his time. And then the Christmas Bird Count started in 1900, and maybe there still were no cardinals here. Cardinals really crept northward, partly because of climate change, but also because of landscape habits. In the 50s and 60s, we started planting a lot more berries and non-native things, changing the ecology of the landscape, and those factors allowed northern cardinals to successfully expand their territory northward. And the data from the Christmas Bird Count would show things like, what was the first year that a cardinal was reported on the Christmas Bird Count in Boston? Was it one cardinal that first time? Maybe 5 years later, there were 10 cardinals. And it grew and grew, right? So we start to see those patterns. And more often than not, now we're also seeing birds that are no longer here at this time of year because of climate change.
Got it. I did read an article in Audubon, and I thought you would be proud of me. This happened to pop up on my social media feed or something. And it was talking about something like 300 species or so that they've kind of been keeping track of. 60% of those birds have moved their wintering grounds farther up north. So does some of that data come from things like the Christmas Bird Count?
Exactly. The Christmas Count. So probably the best citizen science in this area right now is from the application eBird, which is a platform to put in your sightings. And lots of birders report what they see all the time, every day of the year. But the Christmas Count is better for a periodic data point over a longer period of time because we have data back to 1900 all along the way, whereas most eBird data is, modern, sort of 2010 onward, especially maybe 2005 onward.
Okay. All right. So it gives you the ability to compare kind of the historical record in comparison to how things are now, whereas more of the modern apps don't have that historical record that they can make those deeper comparisons to.
Right. And they certainly are importing historic data into eBird and other stuff to help normalize it. But at the same time, all the historic data was from a very small subset of like ornithologists, whereas birding is much more popular now. And there's probably a lot more data captured on any given day than might have been captured in a whole year in 1915.
Okay, so then let's get into it. Let's talk about this year. So I had this idea to record this video while Dustin was out doing the bird count with his birding friends. And therefore, I haven't asked him very much about how it went because it was it yesterday, right?
It was yesterday.
So first thing I want to point out is it doesn't happen on Christmas anymore.
No, each circle gets to decide when they conduct it within about a month. I forget the parameters, but I think they might have to choose a date between like December 10th and January 15th or something.
Okay.
Most circles have a very specific weekend. Ours tends to always be the Sunday after Christmas Day.
Okay. So here's what I know about yesterday so we live in eastern Massachusetts near the Concord area. And yesterday was a really weird weather day because it's been like in the 20s or so up until recently, which is typical for this time of year. But yesterday it warmed up a little bit. It got into the 40s. And because of that, we had a tremendous amount of fog in this area. So what I figured we could talk about now is just, to me, it didn't seem like a really great day to be out there trying to count birds. So how did it go? Like, what did you see? Was there any memorable sightings that came up? Did the weather impact you? I would imagine that from year to year, you have good years and bad years.
Yeah, I mean, lately, climate change has generally made the Christmas count warmer and more tolerable, and also allowed more species to winter farther north. So generally, in the modern era, climate change has made the Christmas count better, so to speak, for finding birds. But yesterday was terrible. So there were really two contributing factors. One is, although we've been getting ice on the water later than usual the last 10 or 20 years, noticeably so, that I've observed, we did have a very cold stretch the last 10 days or so, and all of the local water bodies were frozen. So waterfowl, geese and mergansers, and even mallards were really hard to come by yesterday because all of the water was frozen, even though it was a very warm day. That warmth, and especially over the wetlands, created tons of fog. It was very heavy fog and misty, kind of drizzly rain off and on all day long. So visibility was really low. It was really hard to make out birds in the distance if you could even see them. We certainly saw no raptors soaring overhead. If they were up there, there's no way we could see them. So we were very low on waterfowl. My group had only Canada geese and nothing else in terms of water birds. And we only had a single raptor, one Cooper's hawk. We didn't see a single red-tailed hawk, which is crazy. Usually we see, 8 or 10 red tails and have a hard time with the other ones.
So do you think it was because of the weather and just visibility was bad, or like all the raptors didn't disappear from the area, right?
No, but it wasn't great hunting conditions for them either.
I
So
see.
they were probably hunkered down a little bit, sitting in the trees where normally we could see them, 300 yards away. We could only see them 50 yards away.
Okay.
And more often than not, right, you see a red tail in the sky soaring around. There was none of that because it was just too cloudy to see anything.
So I was going to ask you if you saw like anything memorable or weird or unexpected, but it doesn't sound like this was the year for that.
No, I mean, probably the most memorable is we had a great horned owl that flew right across the trail and proceeded to sit about 100 yards from us where we could plainly see it, which was great. But it was also at noontime, which is unusual, right? Usually crews go out early before the sun even comes up, or try to stay out late to try to get great horned owls on, known patches where they're known to be. But we got it at noontime, which was pretty unusual, but it was very, overcast. So it probably didn't feel like, the peak of midday to an owl.
So how do you know what time your group's going to start? And like, how do you know when it's time to call it a day? Because you're out there for a pretty long time, but it seems to vary from year to year.
It doesn't vary very much. We plan on sunrise to sunset for regular birding.
Okay.
And then some extra volunteers that might go out before sunrise in order to look for owls, particularly if they've been heard in different places. By the way, not everything has to be counted on count day. Count week is a thing also. So if there's a particularly notable species, it'll get counted as a count week bird if it was seen up to 3 days in advance of the Christmas count day or up to 3 days after Christmas count day.
What about, like, are you only counting birds that you see in the wild? Like, what about people who have bird feeders out?
You asked 2 questions there.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we're counting all wild birds. Seeing someone's chickens that are captive doesn't count.
No, that's not what I meant.
Or going by, the local zoo and catching a cockatiel, that doesn't count either. But yes, we count birds at feeders. Those are wild birds, and feeders are a good place to make sure you check. So everywhere we drove, we weren't just driving from like conservation land to conservation land. We're driving all through the neighborhoods, going to the known feeder hotspots, and spending a minute or 2 seeing what was at all those feeders.
Got it. So I'm not going to get into it now, but there's a reason why I'm asking you in particular about bird feeders, but we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it later on. All right.
Okay.
So for myself, I will say I always define myself when it comes to this particular topic. I am not a birder. I am bird adjacent, thanks to Dustin. Why should people like me who are not birders but care about nature, why should we care about this event? Because this is very focused on counting one particular type of animal, birds. So how is this relevant to those of us who I like birds, but I don't worry about their numbers.
Sure. So you know why miners brought canaries down into their mines, right?
So that if there was poor air quality, they would see, unfortunately, the cute little canaries die. And that would be their indication that they needed to get out of the mines quickly.
Right. Birds are an essential indicator of the health of a habitat.
Okay.
If a water body, for example, is caked in oil and is just mud and doesn't filter well, right, it won't support the life that birds need. If a forest is covered in pesticides and there's no, beetle and bug larvae in the trees all winter, the birds aren't going to have anything to find, and they're either going to die or they're going to move on. So that essential nature of birds makes them a prime indicator, and it gets a lot of people interested in the health of birds because it's also very observable. There's some years where we have 30 blue jays outside at the feeders, and other years where we seem to only have a handful because they ebb and flow.
Got it. Okay. All right. So have you noticed you said that you've done this for 8 years now or so? Have you yourself noticed any changes or trends in the time that you've participated? I know it's a very small sample size of years, but...
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's anything noticeable for me, except that it's clear that the number of species is down from what we would expect to see compared to Christmas counts more like 40, 50, 60 years ago and longer. Because some of the stuff, human trends change over time as well, right? So certainly there's a lot less farmland than there was in the early 1900s. Therefore, there's less grassland birds. Here in Massachusetts, we don't really on Christmas count day see any, meadowlarks or things like that. They usually migrate out, but sometimes they hang out over the wintertime. But if they're really low, even in the summer, then they're practically, never going to be present in the wintertime. So stuff like that. It's certainly, there's certain species like a Carolina wren that lots of people know about because you see them around our yard. They used to never overwinter in Massachusetts. But in the last 20 years, they're noticeably around more. And Carolina wren, we had 13 of them yesterday.
Interesting. What about Audubon? Now that you're participating in their Christmas event, do you pay attention more? Do they put out any statements from year to year about what the bird count is telling them so that people like you who volunteer?
I forget the frequency, but there is sort of a state of the birds that comes out. I forget if it's every year, every other year. And they do, big studies and not just Audubon too. There's like the ABA, the American Birding Association, does the bird of the year every year. And that'll be a big announcement coming up here. The first of the year is right around the corner, and there'll be a public relations announcement about what the bird of the year is. By the way, the new president of the American Birding Association is someone named Wayne Klockner, who I've birded with right across our lake before.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's cool.
Oh, that's neat. Okay. So if people wanted to get involved in a bird count next Christmas time, what advice would you give to somebody who's never done it before?
Yeah, the first thing is talk to and bird with the best birders you know. If you can find some birders in your area, join a walk, schedule a walk yourself, see if anyone else shows up, ask questions, right? But short of that, get on Google, right? And do Christmas bird count and type in your city or your metropolitan area. And oftentimes there's a regional bird group that lists each of the circles that are in your area and who the leaders are for the circle. Some circles, like the Concord, Massachusetts circle that we participated in this year, have their own website that has their map and the contacts for every town leader. Others, it might just be an email address that says, if you want to volunteer, email so-and-so.
Okay. So I'm kind of into inclusivity. What if you're someone who thinks this is a really interesting topic, but the idea of hiking 6 miles in the course of a day, or even having transportation to drive around for 25 miles for the full day is something that is just beyond your means? Like, are there people who participate and just focus on like bird feeders or smaller neighborhoods or stuff like that?
Yep. So it basically breaks down into 2 types of watchers. There's the ones outdoors traveling around counting, and there's a team of feeder watchers in every town as well. And anyone can sign up to be a feeder watcher. And it just sort of requires that you spend a significant amount of time watching your feeders that day. It doesn't have to be every minute for 8 hours, but you definitely want to spend some dedicated time watching what's at the feeder and follow the protocols that are distributed to the feeder watchers, which is basically to count how many individuals you see at a species simultaneously at any one given time. If you see 7 chickadees over the course of a day, you don't really know if it's the same chickadee that was visiting 7 times, or if it was 2 chickadees that kept coming back and 5 other ones, right? So you would only count the maximum number you saw concurrently at the feeder at any time during the day.
I was going to ask you about that because I know from our bird feeders, if you're watching them, like they come and they feed and then they go away and then they come back. So I was going to ask, like, well, what if you're double counting the same bird?
Right. And that's sort of the most accessible way that anyone can participate. But not everyone has the ability to have a good feeder station, right? If you sort of live in a high-rise apartment, something like that, that might not be the best for you. The next is to join a count, and lots of teams and counters are really focused on moving around town in a car and getting to all the feeders. So you can bring some binoculars or, even do it with the naked eye and be a passenger in a car and volunteer that way. And if you're not, say, skilled birder and you don't want to sort of be responsible for identifying species, you could volunteer to just be a tabulator for your team to take the notes on what everyone else identifies so that they don't have to, be staring down at a clipboard when they could be looking in their binoculars.
Oh, that's cool. So that if you don't have binoculars, or as you said, if you're starting to bird, you can do it that way. And I would imagine for some of this counting, you have a really top of the line pair of binoculars, because with all the work that you do with conservation and wildlife photography, you're out there constantly. But do you really need, you don't need a top of the line pair of binoculars for this, right?
No, I'd say to sort of continue the previous thought, the next level of participation would be some towns, especially coastal towns, I'm sure have folks that are kind of assigned to a specific marsh or a specific sort of stationary location to be using a spotting scope. And in those cases, you'd sort of be sharing someone else's spotting scope. You wouldn't everyone doesn't need to bring their own scope, right? And that's not usually how that sort of works. But then that leads to what you're asking is what you need for equipment. So sure, you could be a counter with no scope at all, right? You could be watching your feeders with your naked eye. You could go out, walk around your local lake or your assigned area, right? Most people know a lot of common birds just by their naked eye, right? Cardinals, mourning doves, a red-tailed hawk up in the sky, usually people can ID, that kind of stuff. And there's lots of, very serviceable binoculars for inexpensive now. $200 or $300 to me is well worth an investment, even if it sounds expensive to you. Think about it's something that you will use for 10, 20 years or more every time you go out birding. So the cost per trip is really, really low. So you don't need expensive binoculars because most people with an inexpensive pair of binoculars will still be able to bird, 99.9% as well as someone who has a really high level. The difference is in low light situations. But you can get a very, very good view of a cardinal at, 50 yards distance with any pair of binoculars.
Got it. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I don't think we've ever talked about is, I know what birding means to you. I know what conservation means to you. But you seem to have an incredible fondness for this event. And I will say, as Dustin's wife, he announces this fairly early on. As soon as he knows what the date is going to be for the group, he lets me and our daughter know, like, this day I am devoting to this on our holiday break. I am not doing anything else. This is for this. So with that in mind and having observed that about you, what does this event kind of mean to you personally?
Well, mainly it's the kind of thing that you don't want to do for 1 hour or some variable amount of time every year, right? You want to be consistent at the way that the data is collected and the places that get visited. So it just makes sense. And it kind of falls into the patterns of our holiday time off. So it just feels like one of the rhythms of our lives. But also there's some camaraderie to it with the other members of the team and the friends that we volunteer with. And there's always some new birders that are coming along as well.
Awesome. And, any words of encouragement for other people who are maybe listening to you talk about this and thinking, I wonder if this would be something more meaningful for me to get involved in?
I think the important thing is to set your intention now. If you want to do Christmas Bird Count next year, set the intention to do it now, and then set about finding who's doing the reporting and the events that might be happening to talk about the birds that we're seeing in your area. Even if you don't come across that, know that when you look for your walks in the springtime, that you want to do those with experienced birders in the area, and they're going to be the ones that are connected into the Christmas Bird Count. And if you end up Googling to find your circle, contact them early to make that connection. That way, when you contact them later on in the year, you'll be automatically in their mailing list and things like that for the announcements. You won't be sort of finding out late and trying to chase down a team or something that might already be established.
And what it makes me kind of think of is I got into a conversation in the past couple of weeks with a few people on social media who were talking about, it was on a Reddit forum. This person posted this subreddit post basically saying that they kind of feel like there's a variety of different ways in the world that we could all be helping to make improvements, right? But there's only so many hours in the day, and it can be kind of like a little overwhelming to figure out, how you can do something to kind of have an impact or just get involved. This seems like kind of an interesting way to go about it, right? If you're concerned about or you care about the environment or nature or wildlife, it's one day out of the year, but you're adding to some important data points that help Audubon and society as a whole to understand.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to identify the place where you can make a difference in the world. But most of the time when that happens, think local and you'll find something local. So this is a really good way to be, on the ground in, at your yard or in your neighborhood or in your town or on local conservation lands, which is healthy and refreshing all on its own. But then it gets you connected to people that are tuned in with the themes and the programs and the things that are happening in your area. And it's likely to lead to more events throughout the year to learn more about birding and the natural ecology in your area. And make some friends along the way, because I guarantee you, if you're into the Christmas bird count, you like the idea, you're probably going to be birding at other times of year too.
Yeah, and I will say, as an adjacent birder, one of the things that I've noticed since you've gotten involved with birding is, number one, our group of friends has vastly expanded. And it's a fairly tight-knit group that you guys all seem to have like a really positive and happy attitude. Because what I see happening is someone in Dustin's friend group notices a bird somewhere locally, and it's an exciting moment because sometimes it's a rare bird. And the next thing you know, you'll get a text message, and then one of your friends shows up to pick you up, and then you guys go off to look at the bird, or you're sharing pictures of the birds, or you're talking about your hike that you guys took on the weekend or whatever. But there's nothing like, it's not intensive. You know what I mean? There's nothing really political about it. It's just, it's something that you're all just experiencing together, and it has a positive impact in general on the local environment.
Exactly. It's a tangible thing that we can share that gets you out of your daily routine or your headspace of working or stress, and allows you to share joy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Right? Where there's some joy in knowing that this good thing is happening. There's some joy in knowing people discovered it or got to experience it. And there's some joy in finding it on your own. Some people love chasing and will drive, 100 miles to see a rare owl that happened to show up. Other people love to repeatedly hit the same patch of ground and find something that hadn't been recorded there in that space in the past. And sort of going back to your earlier question is, why do this every year? One of the things about birding is it's very immersive in the moment. And it can be frustrating to do that for 3 minutes here and there throughout your day because you're in and out of that headspace. Some people are very auditory, listening for the birds, and some people are very visual, looking for them. Others like examining the habitat and seeing what birds find them by noticing that stuff. But birding being a very immersive experience makes the Christmas count one of the most immersive birding experiences of the year.
Interesting. All right. So I think I don't have any. Actually, I have one more question that just popped into my head, and then you can kind of close us out. So you mentioned auditory. What if you are out during a bird count and you hear the bird, but you don't see it? Do you count it?
Yes, you absolutely count it if you're certain that that's what it was.
Okay.
There's a few birds, for example, a blue jay will mimic the call of a red-shouldered hawk. If I know there's blue jays around, I'm not going to count a red-shouldered hawk unless I see it.
And that drives our dog crazy because he gets mad when big birds fly over our house. And every once in a while, a blue jay will make that call, and he runs to the window because he thinks there's a hawk out there, and there isn't.
Yeah. And similarly, birding by ear might help you identify that a species is present, but it doesn't usually help you count that species. Because if you hear a chickadee call, chickadee-dee, and then over here, chickadee-dee, and then third one, chickadee-dee, was it 3 chickadees? You
Yeah.
don't really know. You just heard it 3 times. Sometimes you can tell, one of them was coming from my left and another one was coming from my right at about the same time. They couldn't be the same one. So there's some of that skill to conservatively count every bird that you see or hear.
Okay. So I don't have anything else to add. Is there any final thoughts that you have?
Just a reminder to everyone to keep your eyes on the skies and your heart in the wild.